Hello, extempers, debaters, speech and debaters, and everybody else listening to this podcast episode. Today, we're going to talk about something either you have already heard about that's popped up in the news, that's popped up in your Instagram page, but something that mainly people will scroll over, but it's still a very important part of international security and our international community. So today, we're going to talk about the violence and the protests that have been happening in Kazakhstan and instability, basically. As always, welcome back to listening to the half hour. I'm YuYu.
I'm Spencer.
And we can't wait to share with you all of the tea that we have found on Kazakhstan and why it's important that you should be paying attention to this small country that doesn't tend to show its name in the news. And yeah, I feel that talking about these protests and kind of how international actors are getting involved into these conflicts of smaller countries or countries with like less resources is really important into discussion about like global politics, international security, and the like. And I'm sure Spencer would agree with me.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we don't really talk about social issues on this channel a lot. And this is a really big social issue. We tend to be a lot more boring, political, economic. We talk a lot about tech. We've talked science. It's time to really hit something that's a major social issue. And this really has been gaining some attention. So if you've been scrolling over this, it's time to stop because this is going to appear a lot in Extemp. And this is probably going to appear, at least in our state, it's going to appear for the rest of the season. These protests are pretty big, and I don't anticipate them going away anytime soon. Before we get into anything, we do want to mention that this is a depiction of violence in this episode. Viewer discretion just advised. If you have trouble with listening to this, we're not going to go into too much of the violence about it, right? I mean, it has been violent. There has been buildings that have been burned. They are burning capital city. They're burning city hall buildings. There are random killings of people being ordered by the president to physically go and shoot people without any warning. Okay, this is a real problem. So this is depictions of violence. We're not going to go too much into it besides the fact of what I just listed off. But it is important to note that viewer discretion advised. If you don't like violence, we ask you to click off. And as much as we enjoy the views, right? If this is not something that if you enjoy listening to, do not listen to this episode. Anything else from you?
No, I think that about covers it. While I guess it is more of a social issue that has sparked these protests, keep in mind that social issues and politics tend to get intertwined with each other. So even if we are talking about social issues, it is heavily politicized as well. So whenever you're ready, we can get right into it.
All right. Let's talk about Kazakhstan. Let's talk about what's going on. And the first thing we're going to ask is, why are these protests happening? And basically what happened is Kazakhstan lifted a price cap on liquefied petroleum gas. It's typically referred to as LPG. That's how you'll probably see it in most articles. Basically, it's a low carbon fuel that most people in Kazakhstan use with their cars. It's a really good energy source. It's one of the best types of fuel on the planet for cars that is carbon friendly. But even though that's what sparked the protests are a lot more than just this. They are a result of disparities that are occurring in Kazakhstan, both economic and social. Basically, this is the coronavirus pandemic that's just insanely all over the place. And basically, their democracy is not a democracy. To put into a note, the average wage is equivalent to $570 per month for citizens living in Kazakhstan. This is according to their government statistics. But we do know that many people are earning far less than this. So what do these protesters want? Well, obviously, there is the discussion on lower fuel prices, but there's a need for better political liberalization. One change they are seeking is an election system for regional leaders. Currently, these leaders are appointed by Kazakhstan President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. I 100% butchered that. That's fine. Basically, this would oust these changes would oust political forces that have been in this country since 1991. This would be a major change if these protests were to succeed. So, why does this issue even matter? Well, there's 4 reasons. The first one is geography. Kazakhstan is the largest landlocked region across the globe and is sandwiched between 2 major global powers, Russia and China. Typically, this country has seen success in what is an unstable region. So basically, while it's next to 2 very strong countries, it also happens to be in the Middle East. And for some reason, this country hasn't seen a lot of news such as this. So these protests are showing that there is still uncertainty in an area that should already be, or that the uncertainty does exist in an area that is technically considered as unstable. The second reason is Russia. Kazakhstan is currently aligned with Russia and Russian President Vladimir Putin. And Putin still views Kazakhstan as a part of Russia's sphere of influence. It's important to note that Kazakhstan was a part of the USSR before it collapsed. And what Putin has wanted to do is to work with former Soviet republics to regain that influence once seen by the USSR. So he basically wants to, in essence, rebuild the USSR in a new and improved way, per se. In essence, this has led to the intervention of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Basically, the best way to think of that is a Russian NATO. And this is the first time the protection clause has been invoked from this, and there holds a ton of uncertainty about geopolitics in this region. The third thing is the uprising against the Kremlin. These events show how uprising protests are becoming a threat to former Soviet nations. It is the third set of protests against an authoritarian Kremlin-aligned government. The first was Ukraine in 2014. The second was Belarus in 2020. These protests could lead to a setup of other nations who are watching these protests closely that are Kremlin-aligned. In essence, there could be a major uprising in a number of other former USSR nations in hopes that there could be these transitions to democracy. The fourth issue, obviously, is the United States. The U.S. actually holds a big part in Kazakhstan, and it's because of energy concerns. ExxonMobil and Chevron have invested tens of billions of dollars in Western Kazakhstan. This is the region where the unrest actually began this month. Even though Kazakhstan has close ties with Moscow, the U.S. has maintained a close relationship with the country. The U.S. has viewed this nation better than other USSR nations, such as Belarus. And one of the biggest things that the United States sees is oil investment as a counterweight for the U.S. against Russia. So, in short, right, these protests are happening basically because of the fuel prices. But other issues that have happened, political, social, and economical, have led people to realize maybe it's time for a major change, right? And these protests are basically reflecting upon a change that issues that they've been dealing with now for, what would it be, 30 years? So kind of a big issue, YuYu. We have a country that wants to spark major change in its government, in its economic system, and to better the social lives of everybody.
Yeah. And speaking of how this has been a call for major change, that's been a pretty big issue in Kazakhstan for the past 30 years, as you've said. And we'll get more into that later on in my section when we talk about the history behind that and why it was such a big controversy and why things haven't really been improving since then. And then as it leads to the protests that are happening now. So when looking at the multiple perspectives or countries that have been dragged into this conflict, there are a few that are more important than others. We'll start with this conflict domestically, and then we'll do the international actors. So what does Kazakhstan's government think about these protests? Well, as you can imagine, the reception was not good at all. The current president of Kazakhstan, President Tokayev, has called the protesters a band of terrorists, or just bands, and accused many of them of being Islamic terrorists who were trained abroad and came to cause and wreak havoc in Kazakhstan. The official listed death toll at the moment is 164, but Tokayev has made the statement that thousands have died in these protests due to these bands of terrorists or these bandits wreaking havoc in Kazakhstan. The information ministry, however, in Kazakhstan has recalled the number of 164 back, which weird, but okay, and have actually decreased the number instead of increasing the number from 164 deaths to a total of actually just 44 deaths. So whether or not they're correct about the death toll or not, whatever, we'll find out later in the news. But along with declaring the protesters as terrorists and bandits, the state has also declared a state of emergency and banned all social media usage in attempts to quell the protests and to stop the violence from happening. They have even surprisingly stated that, hey, if we can calm these protests down, we will dissolve parliament and we'll call for a new election. But then the likelihood of that happening is very slim and hasn't really done anything to stop the protests anyway, possibly because the people already know that they aren't going to get what they're promised. And as a result so far of kind of what the government would call quelling or stopping the violence from happening in Kazakhstan, they have detained a total of 9,800 people who were a part of the protests. This also brings into the question the stability of the government as it goes beyond the oil prices that have hiked up because of the fact that there have been these protests, like 20,000 people have participated in this protest, but then they started to detain like 9,000 or more of these protesters. It really brings up the question of the stability of the government because of their ability to kind of provide for the people and to keep the people happy and supportive of the government. So the history behind that is that former President Nazarbayev enjoyed a 30-decade rule up until 2019 when President Tokayev was elected. As you can imagine, in the 30 years that Nazarbayev have enjoyed ruling, it was because of corruption. Elections were very corrupt. He had detained people who had spoke out against him, and there wasn't a lot of political dissidence because he had already started the process of like arresting those people and detaining them before they could do anything. However, this wasn't really stable anyway. People didn't really like him. And as a result, it's why he had to eventually step down in 2019 and allow Tokayev to take the presidency. However, keep in mind that despite this, Tokayev's election was also fraught with corruption. We can see how he had tried to kind of detain people who weren't for him as well. And it also brings into the question of whether these elections were true, were fair, or were correct in the first place. And that's why it led to Europe pulling it or like being pulled in and pointing out how it was an unfair election and therefore had to be redone. In this process, though, we have seen protests. Tokayev is starting to promote a more softer image of himself, but it's still pretty clear from recent events that he's maintaining the previous tactics that have been used to cling onto power. Other than internal conflict and governmental stability, Russia had sent around 2,500 troops per the president's request or per Kazakhstan's president's request to quell these protests. So Kazakhstan obviously could do this because of the NATO-like agreement called the CTSO that Spencer talked about. But instead of democratic nations, it's made up of former Soviet nations, which sparks the conversation of like, what is Russia trying to do with its geopolitics and also with its sphere of influence? Is it trying to become a bigger nation to essentially combat Western countries in the United States? Or are they just doing this because it's part of their geopolitics and it's what like everybody else has done? But other than that, Russia has started to withdraw their troops from Kazakhstan already. And again, we also have to consider what Kazakhs themselves had thought of Russia interfering in their own domestic affairs. And the reception wasn't positive, actually. All in all, they realized and recognized that while Russia had came in and quelled the protest or quelled the protests, quote unquote. We also have to take note that Kazakhstan realizes they do owe Russia for their help or for the troops that they've sent. And they're kind of waiting for that price to be paid. And this also adds to that question of like, what's Russia trying to do? But overall, we see that the citizens are not happy with Kazakhstan and their government, and also not happy with the leadership that they're under right now. And this is only just a repeat of the past 30 decades. And whether or not this actually contributes to Russia's sphere of influence and maybe attributing that to Russian aggression, we'll find out in the future. But at the moment, it is what it is. Kazakhstan's violence has sparked a lot of conversation and a lot of controversy.
Absolutely. Definitely an interesting conflict. I will say that I think that was one of our fastest backgrounds that we've ever done on this. But that is a good thing because that gives us a lot of time to talk about questions. And I honestly don't think we hear a lot of discussion from us anymore with these questions. So this could actually be really good. The big question that we have got here today, and we might go into a second one if we think we've got time. But the big question is, will street protests in Kazakhstan produce lasting change? YuYu, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. So from the information that we both kind of brought up and talked about so far, it might lead you to believe that protests will actually cause lasting effects in Kazakhstan. Whether that produces change or not, we'll see. But it has caused a lot of pressure against the government to enact some sort of change. It caused them to be so desperate in terms of like having, what should we do to quell this protest, that they decided, okay, fine, we'll concede some of these things. We'll even dissolve our parliament and let you re-elect them again. But then again, promises from the Kazakhstan government haven't exactly been met. And so the people obviously would protest again and probably would still continue resisting the government there. This started because of like oil prices and stuff, but you then have to take into account the history of how there's been corruption within the government and how the people were unhappy anyway. And so whether or not these protests specifically will cause lasting change and lasting effect, we'll see more as like more news comes in. But if they do have the help of Russia to like quell these protests, or they do have the ability to quell these protests and just like dissolve it completely and like detain people, then these protests won't necessarily have lasting changes or lasting effects.
I think I kind of agree with you. I think with this question right now, the best way to look at it is maybe through like historical protests, because it's still a fairly new protest. So we can maybe make draws off of protests, the yellow vest protest in France, which is basically started by the same thing. It was rise in price of gas. So that's probably a really good comparison, just to maybe start there. And did that really produce effective change? Well, some argue that those protests are still like going on. People are still like not happy with the French government based off of it. So, and those were still appearing in the news all the way up until 2020 before like the pandemic. So the yellow vest protests, in all honesty, I believe were unsuccessful. So if we like draw and we make two comparisons, you can say it's got like a similar approach to what happened in France a couple of years ago. And that would in essence lead to the situation not producing lasting change. So I think if you draw off of other international conflicts that have the same value, you can probably propose that answer as a obvious no. And if this is if Russia's going to get involved, I mean, this could just turn into a mess. And honestly, like, I think we've talked about this before. Violent protests don't really work well. So burning down city halls is not really a good option to make your protests look like they're trying to produce meaningful change. So like that's trying to go into like anarchy. kind of thing, right? We're really trying to revolutionize and change what's going on. I personally think that the way that these people get that change is, it's going to sound really bad. But I think that if Russia's going to get involved and these protesters are really solidified on wanting a change in their government, like, we are still talking about the Middle East. The Middle East has always been riddled with conflict. This could actually turn into war. Okay. Like, I don't think that is an unreasonable thought. You may correct me on that and maybe change my mind here. But like, we're still talking Middle East here. And if they really want lasting change and a change in a government, then especially against a major power such as Russia, that could actually be it could lead into like a big war cry from Kazakhs.
I think the potential for it leading to war from the Kazakhs could be a reality in terms of just like how things play out and how international actors will intervene in the matter. However, while the US is like a part of this problem, or not problem, a part of this like issue in terms of like how it affects international actors, it's not really in it for saving the people of Kazakhstan. They're mainly in it for like economic reasons at the moment. And I feel with the trajectory of how US politics has been, it seems like they are less likely to internationally intervene, as seen with like Biden's decision to pull the troops out of Afghanistan. Then again, like, that might not necessarily be fully him, but it is still kind of like in that trajectory path. So whether or not he decides to intervene, specifically if Russia decides to intervene in Kazakhstan, will be up to him and his like advisors. But at the moment, I don't necessarily know if there is a lot of, I would say, like other international supporters who will be there to fight against that. If it does get more like recognition globally, if it is becoming like noticed by the global community, by the international community, and some of those countries decide we need to like help these people and like help these people gain more rights from this authoritarian ruler, then maybe we can see more intervention from those countries and like more troops from those countries in terms of like fighting against Russia. On that note, though, this protest technically has been already quelled. And we'll see whether or not it's going to produce some more lasting changes. But if the government of Kazakhstan was willing to make some concessions already, maybe they could stop violence from happening, or maybe they could stop like violence from escalating into something more than just these protests that have been happening. However, then again, you do have to consider that these people were not willing to accept any of the concessions, and they just wanted something more, something new, something that they haven't like been able to receive in the past before. So yeah, I could see where you can like go both ways with the question in terms of just how will these will these street protests in Kazakhstan produce lasting change? And I also do think within this question, now that I think about it, is that you have to kind of look at what you mean by lasting changes. Like, what changes are you talking about specifically? Are you talking about international security changes? Or are you talking about domestic changes? You know?
Well, I think jumping off that, kind of in terms of like political perspective, right? We know the people have been struggling with a corrupted government for 30 years, right? So the government's going to make a concession. Why would the people believe it? And like, that's part of the reason why they're protesting, right? So like you said, what is lasting change? Well, is lasting change actually ensuring a democracy? And like, this is an area where democracy is very difficult to get. I can't even recall like that near that area. I don't think any of those former USSR nations in that specific region have a democracy. Actually, I don't think they do. I think they're all authoritarian rule. still. So you have a really big situation where I just don't think that even the government having that concession and following through with it is going to be something that's going to stop these protests. I personally, like, while I may have made the claim of like this could look like something that is worth, once again, I will say that conflict is very unlikely. It's just that's just the nature of conflict in general. But this is something that could spark a lot of change. Remember, other countries, the other former USSR countries, are looking at this as like one of the biggest, like it's a big uprising, right? Belarus kind of went unnoticed in 2020. It was like a pretty like big, it was a big change, right? But this is the one that's like Kazakhstan is a massive country. It only has 19 million people, but it is a big country, and that can give like a lot of room for other former USSR nations to take that as a sign of maybe it's time to make that change and officially like break up with Russia's sphere of influence, right? Lasting change for me, I think, is a little bit more of a political perspective here. Really what that goal is to like restore like having a democracy that actually functions as a democracy and not functioning as a corrupted government. And I guess the question here is like for both of us is like, and I don't know. But I personally think that as of now, the answer is no. Russia being involved can scare people. But if they're really committed to this change, I think that these violent protests could turn into more. And that's kind of where I'm going here, right? At the end of the day, I think conflict always is very unlikely. It's always more minimal than what people think. But ultimately, these protests they're noticeable. And other former USSR nations taking notice of it, I think, is a really key part into understanding where this conflict has potential as to like maybe officially having that breakup of the USSR.
I think like Spencer has brought up a lot of like important points to think about in terms of answering this question and in terms of just like answering any geopolitical questions that you'll get in Extemp. And I think for this question specifically, it'll all boil down to how you interpret change or like lasting change specifically, as that's what the question specifies. And whether you think that lasting change is going to be a political change where Kazakhstan breaks away from Russia, or whether that's going to be a social change where the people get oil prices decreased again, or this transitions into like a democratic type of government. That'll kind of shape the answer that you're going to go for. But I will just say and agree with Spencer that generally right now, it seems like, no, it won't have lasting changes in terms of just what we've seen in the past. And also with like the points that have been brought up.
Yeah, I genuinely think that this is not something that will change much now. Definitely could in the future. Might be an issue that we pay attention to more as we get to March or February or March, because we'll know by then really how important like these protests are. Because like first signs of protests are okay. People want some kind of change, right? It's really when it carries. It's really when it gets like the next month or two, right? Is really when we begin to notice that these are probably bigger than we expect. And that's usually the key for knowing whether or not this is going to be effective at what it's going to do. And let's make like a connection here. You can think of like Black Lives Matter protests in the US, right? back in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, right? We had massive protests in the US. And it was kind of like, it really got big once like it was going on for like a month, right? Because it was going from more than just Minneapolis, it was going into other cities across the nation with different protests. You were seeing them in Georgia, you were seeing them in California, you were seeing them, like, for crying out loud. I had a friend of mine who was talking about them burning police cars in Utah. Like, it's really a big issue kind of like a month or two later, right? And that's when you begin to notice like how these can produce lasting and effective change. And personally, did that produce lasting and effective change? I think it did. It really did push a major issue to the table and definitely has sparked a new movement for the US, right? So I think with this issue, we got to wait and see. Okay. It's going to be another month, or I think it'll be another month or two before we can officially say like these protests are actually a big deal and could really produce that same effective change.
Yeah. And maybe we'll find out when we do our Russia episode. I don't know when that's happening, but like tune in that Russia episode and maybe we'll mention Kazakhstan again and what the protests or the situation there looks like at that moment in time. But overall, I think we did a pretty good job of explaining this whole situation with Kazakhstan and kind of giving you ideas about how to approach the question, both yes and both no. So, as always, thank you so much for listening to this episode and tuning in. If you have stayed till the last bit, you have a special place in my heart because I love doing this outro. Tell us how you did in the round. Tell us if you got the one. If you didn't, whatever. You'll do fine next time. You're going to be amazing. I just know it. But if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to either me or to Spencer. We are available on our new Instagram page, but also on our personal Instagram as well. If you want to email us, feel free to do that. Other than that, go give our Instagram a follow. Go give our Twitter a follow to keep updated on all events and also behind the scenes footage. But also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're on the YouTube channel. And also hit the bell so that you're notified whenever we post our episodes. Thank you so much.
Episodes
we love you all.
Will probably be posted later than 8 at this point. We're noticing traffic is a little better at noon. So we're going to start seeing, there'll probably be noon posts on Wednesdays. Twitter, Instagram links in the description. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, we will see you all later.